On the night Hollywood crowned its kings, Tom Hanks vanished. The Oscars buzzed with scandal as his empty seat overshadowed the golden statues. But the truth lay 12 miles east, in a hospice room where a dying girl's final wish echoed louder than applause. While nominees clutched trophies, Hanks held Emily's hand, performing Forrest Gump's monologue as her heartbeat faded. By dawn, he traded fame for a legacy. A fund for terminally ill children, turning Hollywood's glitter into a revolution of compassion. But what price did he pay for that choice? And how did one girl's laughter rewrite the rules of stardom? Stay tuned if you want to know how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. Los Angeles wore its Oscars night glamour like a crown of thorns. Sunset Boulevard pulsed with limousines gliding toward the Dolby Theater, their chrome grills catching the last amber streaks of daylight. Inside those tinted windows sat faces chiseled by ambition and Botox, rehearsing acceptance speeches in murmured mantras. But one limo, black, unremarkable except for the absence of its passenger, rolled to the curb with a hollowness that would later haunt tabloid headlines. The driver, a man named Luis who'd ferried Hanks to 3 previous Oscars, stepped out alone, his polished shoes scuffing the red carpet as paparazzi lenses swiveled in confusion. "Where's Tom?" someone shouted, but Luis only shrugged, his eyes downcast. The question rippled through the crowd, a spark igniting dry tinder. By the time the ceremony's opening montage began, the rumor mill had birthed a dozen theories. A family emergency, a protest against the Academy, a secret feud with Spielberg. No one considered the truth, because the truth required understanding a man who'd once told 60 Minutes, "Awards are like fireworks. Pretty, but they don't warm your hands." Backstage, the air tasted of hairspray and panic. A production assistant chewed her nails raw as she dialed Hank's manager for the 9th time. "He's not answering." He's never not answered. Nearby, a row of golden statuettes gleamed under fluorescent lights, their silhouettes sharp as scalpels. The showrunner muttered about contingency plans, but the real problem wasn't logistics, it was symbolism. Hanks wasn't just a nominee. He was Hollywood's moral compass, the guy who'd hugged COVID nurses on SNL and sent typewriters to dying journalists. His absence felt like a stain on the industry's conscience. The cameras cut to Hank's empty seat in the 3rd row. Streep leaned over, her diamond earrings catching the light as she whispered to Denzel, "This isn't like him." Denzel nodded, but his jaw tightened, a soldier sensing an ambush. The audience fidgeted, their collective unease masked by polite applause. Meanwhile, in a hospice room 12 miles east, a dying girl's monitor beeped in sync with the Oscars teleplay timer. Hank's phone buzzed silently in his abandoned dressing room, screen lighting up with texts from concerned friends. "You okay? Where are you, man?" The room still held traces of him. A half-empty water bottle, a dog-eared script of Forrest Gump with notes scribbled in margins. Too earnest? Maybe that's the point. And a single white feather tucked into the mirror frame, a prop he'd kept for luck. On the counter lay Emily's letter, its edges softened from being folded and refolded. The night's irony wasn't lost on Hanks as he sped toward the hospice. His Uber driver, a Syrian immigrant named Amir, navigating backstreets to avoid traffic. "You look familiar," Amir said, glancing in the rearview. Hanks smiled, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "I get that a lot." He stared at his reflection in the window, the streetlights blurring his face into a watercolor of shadows. He'd spent decades playing heroes, soldiers, astronauts, captains, but tonight, for the first time, he felt like one. Not the Hollywood kind with capes and quips, but the quiet kind who shows up when the cameras are off. At the hospice, a nurse recognized him instantly. Her gasp echoed down the sterile hallway, but Hanks pressed a finger to his lips. "Just here for Emily," he whispered, as if the girl's name were a prayer. The nurse led him past rooms where life dwindled to flickers. A man humming Sinatra, a woman clutching rosary beads. Emily's door was adorned with crayon drawings, stick figure Gumps running under rainbows. Inside, the machines hissed like disapproving librarians. Emily's mother rose from her chair, her face a mosaic of grief and gratitude. "You came," she breathed, tears carving paths through her mascara. Hanks didn't offer platitudes. He simply took her hand, the gesture saying everything. "I'm here. I see you." Then he turned to Emily, her small frame swallowed by tubes and blankets. Her eyes fluttered open, blue, too old for her face. "Hi, Emily," he said, kneeling beside her bed. "Heard you wanted a story." Outside, the Oscars audience erupted as Best Actor nominees flashed on screen. Hank's face appeared last. A clip from Philadelphia, him gaunt and glorious, whispering, "I'm ready." The crowd cheered, but the applause died when the presenter paused, squinting at the envelope. In the hospice, Hanks began the monologue, his voice rougher than in the film, more human. "That day, keep right on going." Emily's hand found his, her pulse threading with his words. Somewhere, a golden statue waited. Here, a different kind of legacy was being born, one that wouldn't fit on a mantle. By the time the Best Actor winner was announced, Hank's name ringing through the Dolby like a requiem, he was already hours deep into Emily's world. He described shrimp boats and ping-pong rallies, his words painting a sky where pain couldn't reach. The Oscars sat unclaimed, a monument to artifice, while in a room smelling of antiseptic and hope, a girl's laughter rose, light, unburdened, louder than any applause. The letter arrived on a Thursday, slipped between glossy fan mail and studio invitations, in a pile his assistant deemed low priority. It was the envelope that caught his eye, pale blue, the kind of color elementary schools use for art projects, edges frayed as if worried between fingers. Tom Hanks rarely opened his own mail, but something about the smudged postmark from St. Louis made him pause mid-sip of lukewarm coffee. Inside, a single sheet of notebook paper unfolded like a secret, its lines filled with handwriting that wobbled between childish loops and the grim precision of someone running out of time. "Dear Mr. Hanks," it began, "my name is Emily. I'm 14, which is 42 in Cancer years." He read it leaning against his kitchen counter, sunlight pooling around his slippered feet. She'd seen Forrest Gump 27 times, she wrote, once for each round of chemo. The nurses called her Bubba because she'd started quoting the shrimp monologue during blood draws. "Mama says I'll be a star soon, but I don't want to twinkle. I want to laugh like when Forrest says nobody ever gets AIDS from a toilet seat. Can you tell me the bench story, so I'm not scared?" The paper smelled faintly of disinfectant and the strawberry chapstick she'd swiped from a hospital gift shop. Hanks carried the letter for days. It lived in his jacket pocket, creased and reproachful, as he attended script meetings and charity galas. At night, he'd find it half crumpled by his keys, Emily's plea glowing in the dark like a firefly trapped in a jar. He thought of his own children at 14, vibrant, invincible, and how the world had felt infinite then, a road stretching all the way to the horizon. Emily's road ended in weeks, maybe days. Her doctors had switched to comfort care, a term that tasted like ash. The morning of the Oscars, his tailor arrived to adjust his tuxedo. The man fussed over lapels while Hanks stood statue still, staring at his reflection. A mannequin draped in threads worth more than Emily's medical deductible. When the tailor left, he pulled the letter out again. A Polaroid fell from between the folds. Emily, bald and grinning, wearing oversized red sneakers painted with "Run, Emily, Run" in gold Sharpie. On the back, her mother had scribbled "Thank you for making her smile. It's been a while." He drove to Santa Monica Pier that afternoon, a place he hadn't visited since filming Forrest Gump. The carousel still played the same tinny music, its painted horses frozen mid-gallop. Teenagers snapped selfies where Forrest once sat with his chocolates, their laughter as light as the seagulls wheeling above. Hanks bought a corn dog he didn't eat, the grease soaking through the paper wrapper as he walked. Near the arcade, he spotted a feather gray ordinary, caught in a crack of the boardwalk. It might have been from a pigeon, but when he twirled it between his fingers, he heard Robin Wright's voice like a ghost track. "Forrest, you don't know what love is." His phone buzzed incessantly. Reminders for hair and makeup, a final fitting. The Oscars' red carpet waited, a gauntlet of shouted questions and frozen smiles. He pictured Emily's hospice room instead. The beige walls, the wilting get-well balloons, the relentless tick of a clock counting down to nothing. The feather trembled in his hand, a metronome keeping time with his heartbeat. Back home, his Oscar statuette from Philadelphia watched from the bookshelf, its gold plating catching the sunset. People called it his crowning achievement. But all he remembered was the weight of it that night. Cold, heavier than it looked. Emily's Polaroid felt heavier now. He slid it into his tuxedo's breast pocket, over his heart, as his driver honked outside. The limo smelled of leather and anxiety. Luis, behind the wheel, hummed Chariots of Fire as they merged onto the 101. Hanks rolled down the window, letting the smoggy air sting his eyes. At a red light, a homeless man shuffled past holding a sign. Broken but still here. The limo's partition slid open. "Sir? They're asking if you want champagne pre-ceremony or change of plans, Luis." They pulled over on Vine Street, Hank's bow tie dangling undone around his neck. He stepped into the chaos of pre-Oscars LA. Tourists gaping at stars on sidewalks, paparazzi sprinting after a Kardashian's SUV. No one noticed the man in the half-button tux hail an Uber. The driver, a woman with a Farsi pop song playing softly, glanced back once. "You look like that actor," she said. Hank smiled, the feather still pinched between his fingers. "I get that a lot." The hospice loomed at sunset, its stucco walls stained pink by the dying light. A nurse met him at reception, her ID badge swinging like a pendulum. "She's in room 114, she whispered, as if loud noises might hasten the inevitable. The hallway smelled of bleach and burnt coffee. Passing rooms, he caught fragments of final acts. A man singing Blue Suede Shoes off-key, a woman arguing with God in Spanish. Emily's door was decorated with crayon drawings, a feather drifting toward a stick-figure moon. Inside, machines hummed their electronic dirge. Emily's mother jerked upright from a plastic chair, her novel slipping to the floor, The Fault in Our Stars, dog-eared at page 162. She didn't speak, just pressed both hands to her mouth as if holding in a scream or a prayer. Hanks approached the bed slowly, like approaching a wounded bird. Emily slept with one arm flung above her head, her Spider-Man fur line taped to skin so thin he could trace the rivers of her veins. He sat. The chair creaked. Emily's eyes fluttered open blue, but dimmed, like headlights on a dying battery. For a terrible moment, he thought she didn't recognize him. Then her lips quirked, the ghost of the girl in the Polaroid. "Knew you'd come," she rasped. "Jenny always comes back." Outside, the Oscars orchestra struck up its opening number. Inside, Hanks cleared his throat. "Life is like a box of chocolates," he began, but the words caught. He tried again, voice cracking on. "You never know what you're gonna get." Emily's hand crept across the sheets, her fingertips brushing his wrist. He kept going, not as Forrest but as Tom, stumbling through lines about shrimp and ping-pong, his accent slipping into something raw and unpolished. When he reached, "I'm not a smart man, but I know what love is," Emily's monitor stuttered. Her mother gasped, but the girl just smiled, tears cutting through weeks of practiced bravery. Somewhere, Meryl Streep adjusted her posture in anticipation. Somewhere, a golden statue waited on a silk pillow. Here, Hanks talked through the night, past Forrest's script into stories of his own, getting lost backstage at SNL, teaching his son to ride a bike, the time he cried at a grocery store because the peaches looked perfect. Emily's grip never loosened, her pulse threading with his words until dawn bled through the blinds. By sunrise, the feather was gone, lost somewhere between the boardwalk and room 114. But on Emily's bedside table, next to dried flowers and untouched Jell-O, a Polaroid captured a different kind of trophy. A girl's laugh, bright and unburdened, outshining every golden statue ever forged. The hospice room breathed in time with the machines, shallow, mechanical sighs that marked the minutes Tom Hanks would never reclaim. Emily's hand lay in his, a sparrow's weight, her pulse fluttering against his palm like a trapped wing. Outside, Los Angeles glittered, a galaxy of vanity. But here the only light came from a salt lamp casting apricot shadows on walls papered with her drawings. Feather after feather, some soaring, others mid-fall. He'd asked about them earlier. "There for Mama," she'd whispered, "so she knows I'll land soft." He began the monologue as he'd done 1,000 times before, but the words felt foreign now, stripped of their scripted comfort. "Life is like a box of chocolates." The line hung stale, a rehearsed mantra that suddenly reeked of privilege. Emily's eyelids trembled, urging him on. He swallowed, tasting hospital air, antiseptic and impending rain, and tried again. This time, he let the accent slip, the folksy southern drawl dissolving into his own cracked timbre. "You never know what you're gonna get," he rasped, and the truth of it punched through him. Somewhere beyond the hospice walls, the Oscars audience gasped as his name flashed on screen. Best Actor, Tom Hanks. A clip from Castaway playing, his face gaunt and wild under a blood-orange sunset. Here, under the salt lamp's glow, Emily's fingers tightened. "Tell me about Jenny," she murmured, her voice a dry leaf skimming pavement. He hesitated. Jenny's story had always felt like failure to him. Love as a thing that leaves, returns, leaves again. But Emily's thumb stroked his knuckle, insistent. So he rewrote it. He spoke of Jenny as she should have been. A woman who stayed, who learned to love her own cracks, who taught Forrest to read the New York Times instead of running from reporters. Emily's laugh came then, a fragile sound, like ice cracking underfoot. "You're bad at this," she wheezed, but her eyes shone. Outside, a nurse paused mid-round, drawn by the unfamiliar music of giggles in a place reserved for goodbyes. Time blurred. The Oscars cut to commercial, a montage of films that defined a generation. While Hanks described shrimp boat sunrises, the stink of brine and diesel, the way Bubba's voice had cracked on, "I wanna go home," Emily's monitor beeped faster, keeping rhythm with his words. When he reached the park bench scene, the one she'd begged for, he found himself ad-libbing. "Sometimes I think maybe there ain't no point to running. Maybe you just gotta sit. Let people sit with you." Her mother, silent in the corner, began to cry. Not the jagged sobs of grief, but something quieter, older. Hanks didn't pause. He talked through the tremor in his voice, through the Oscars audience's standing ovation for his empty seat, through the moment Emily's grip loosened like a kite string slipping free. He talked until her breathing became a whisper, until the salt lamp's glow seemed to dim, until the only thing left was the story itself. A life raft in a sea of static. Dawn came cruel in its cheerfulness, pink light slicing through blinds. A nurse entered, her shoes squeaking false cheer. Hank stood, joints protesting, and pressed the Polaroid of Emily's red sneakers into her mother's hand. "She told me they made her faster," he said. The woman stared at the photo, at her daughter's sneakers outshining the sun. "She lied," she replied, her first words in hours. "They never let her run." In the hallway, his phone buzzed, 82 missed calls. A news alert? Hank's no-show? Hollywood reels. He silenced it, watching through a window as the city stirred below. A janitor mopped the lobby, his reflection stretching long and thin in the wet linoleum. For a heartbeat, Hank saw Forrest there, that familiar loping gait, forever chasing horizons. Then the man turned, revealing a face weathered by decades of graveyard shifts, and the illusion shattered. The Uber ride back passed in a smear of neon and fog. The driver, this time a retiree with a Vietnam vet cap, hummed "Fortunate Son." Hanks leaned his head against the glass, Emily's feather, now tucked behind his ear, brushing his cheek. At a stoplight, a billboard loomed. His own face hawking a luxury watch, the tagline "Time is precious." He laughed, a hollow sound that startled the driver. "You okay, buddy?" "Yeah," Hanks lied, watching the billboard shrink in the rearview. "Just tired." His mansion awaited, cold as a museum. The Oscar from Philadelphia glared from its shelf, accusatory. He poured bourbon, the good stuff, and stood before the trophy, raising his glass. "To time," he toasted, the liquor burning like truth. Down the hall, his office hummed. A computer waiting to draft the press release. A phone primed to launch Emily's fund. But first, he sank into his leather couch, the feather now twirling between his fingers, and replayed her laugh, the real one, unrecorded, unowned, until sleep claimed him. When he woke, sunlight pooled on the Polaroid he'd kept. Emily mid-laugh, her joy a blade cutting through the hospice gloom. The TV murmured, historic snub sparks debate. But he barely heard. In his palm, the feather trembled, ready to soar. The Dolby Theater spotlight hovered over the vacant seat like an interrogator's lamp, its golden beam exposing the frayed edges of Hollywood's facade. Meryl Streep clutched the unclaimed Oscar, her fingers blanching around its cold spine as cameras zoomed in. A close-up that would later trend with hashtags like #HankSnub and #OscarsMystery. The audience rustled, a garden of taffeta and tuxedos swaying in unease. In their collective imagination, Tom Hanks was already a ghost. Vanished mid-career, another Garbo or Brando, though none dared say it aloud. The teleprompter flashed ad-lib in frantic red letters, but Meryl froze, her legendary poise cracking as she stared at the name engraved on the trophy no one was there to claim. Backstage, a production intern Googled how to unfuck missing winner segment, while publicists huddled like war generals, iPhones glowing like grenades in their palms. The showrunner hissed into a headset, "Cut to commercial now, Jesus Christ." But the director, a maverick who'd shot documentaries in war zones, kept rolling. He'd recognized real drama when he saw it. The broadcast lingered on Hank's empty seat long enough to notice the indent left by his body, the velvet still warm. Social media erupted. Memes of Forrest Gump running from the Oscars, AI-generated conspiracy theories about alien abductions, a TikTok trend where influencers gasped at nothing. But in room 114, 12 miles east, the only audience was a cardiac monitor flatlining its final act. Emily's last breath coincided with the orchestra's failed attempt to play Hanks offstage. Her mother, Karen, didn't scream. She exhaled, a sound like a century-old tree surrendering to wind. Hanks kept hold of Emily's hand even as the nurse began disconnecting tubes, his thumb absently tracing the "Run, Emily, run" doodle on her 4-line. The hospice's wall clock, its numbers worn ghostly from countless vigils, read 9:47 p.m. At the Dolby, they'd just announced Best Picture. Karen pressed her daughter's cheek to the Polaroid they'd taken hours earlier. Emily mid-laugh, Hank's shadow blending with hers like a protector from a silent film. "She wanted you to have this," Karen said, sliding the photo into his tuxedo pocket, where it nestled against his speech notes for an acceptance he'd never give. The gesture felt sacramental, a passing of relics. Outside, paparazzi had staked out the hospice, tipped off by a nurse's Snapchat. Their flashes popped like machine gun fire as Hanks emerged, squinting into the onslaught. A reporter from TMZ shouted, "Was she your mistress?" While another lobbed, "Is this a Scientology thing?" He walked past them, his tuxedo jacket slung over one shoulder, the shirt beneath sweat-stained and missing 3 buttons. A tourist's iPhone caught the moment. Hanks haloed by ambulance lights, looking less like America's dad and more like a man who'd stared into the abyss and found it staring hungrily back. The image would go viral as the un-Oscar. In his limo, Luis had left the radio on, a recap of the night's scandal. Biggest Oscars shock since 2017's Moonlight mix-up, but this time, the envelope wasn't the problem. Hank's publicist has issued no comment. He switched it off, eyeing Hanks in the rearview. "Where to, sir?" "The Santa Monica Pier." It was 3 a.m. when he arrived, the Ferris wheel dark, the arcade silent except for ski balls rolling like distant thunder. He sat on Forrest's bench, the wood worn smooth by tourists and time, and watched Pacific waves erase their own footprints. The Oscar statuette from Philadelphia weighed heavy in his mind. How he'd thanked his high school drama teacher, his wife, the usual litany of gratitude. Now, gratitude felt different. A raw, feral thing with teeth. His phone buzzed. Rita, his assistant. "The board wants an emergency Zoom at dawn. Also, Spielberg says call him. Also, your Twitter mentions." He deleted the notification, focusing on the feather twirling between his fingers. Not the one from Emily's room, but a new one, salt-crusted and scavenged from the pier. When the first joggers appeared at dawn, he was still there, a rumpled monument. A woman in neon spandex did a double take, then slowed. "You're him," she panted, not unkindly. He nodded. She hesitated, then tossed him a protein bar from her fanny pack. "Whatever you're going through, don't let the bastards win." He smiled, the kind that hurt. "They're not the problem." The protein bar stayed unopened in his pocket next to the Polaroid as he walked to the press conference. Network vans lined the street, satellite dishes tilted like hungry mouths. Inside, a junior publicist hyperventilated into a paper bag while technicians tested mics. Hanks bypassed the green room, the crisis managers, the bullet-pointed apologies. He stepped to the podium, still smelling of seaweed and hospital, the feather now tucked behind his ear. Cameras clicked like locusts. He unfolded Emily's letter, smoothed it over the lectern. "Her name was Emily Grace Morales," he began, and the room stilled. He didn't mention the Oscars, the snub, the speculation. He talked about her red sneakers, her shrimp boat drawings, how she'd made him rewrite Jenny's ending. "She taught me that stories don't belong to the people who tell them," he said, the feather trembling in his hand. "They belong to those who need them." When he announced Emily's fund, the room stayed silent. Not the frosty silence of judgment, but the sacred hush of a bell's reverberation. A reporter from Variety later wrote that it felt less like a press conference and more like a laying on of hands. That night, back home, Hank stood before his Oscar shelf. The Philadelphia statue watched, smug in its permanence. He took it down, weighing it against Emily's Polaroid. The gold felt cheap now, a gilded lie. In the photo, Emily's sneakers glowed impossibly red, her joy a verdict on every trophy ever forged. He placed the Oscar in a drawer, next to old passports and divorce papers from a marriage that hadn't stuck. The feather went on the shelf instead, its veins catching moonlight like a promise. Somewhere in St. Louis, Karen Morales pressed play on Forrest Gump for the 28th time, her finger hovering over the scene where Tom Hanks, no, Forrest, says, "I'm not a smart man, but I know what love is." Outside, Los Angeles buzzed with tomorrow's scandal. But in the quiet, where real legacies are born, a new story was already writing itself. One that no golden statue could contain. The morning after the press conference, Los Angeles woke to a city reborn in paradox. Billboard trucks crawled down Sunset Boulevard, Hank's face plastered on their sides above the words "Emily's Fund." Because every kid deserves a sequel. Paparazzi who'd once stalked him for affairs now camped outside children's hospitals, their lenses trained on bald toddlers waving from windows. In Malibu, agents sipped kombucha and debated whether Hank's move was brand suicide or genius rebranding. Unaware that the man himself sat in a Starbucks drive-thru, stirring honey into bitter black coffee, the feather from Santa Monica Pier tucked behind his ear like a pirate's prize. The fund's first donation came at 6:03 a.m., $14.27 from a retired teacher in Des Moines, the exact price of a Forrest Gump Blu-ray. By noon, it had snowballed. Tech billionaires vying for tax breaks, studios scrambling to match donations in honor of our friend Tom. Even a viral hashtag Run Emily Run challenge where marathoners raced in red sneakers. Hank's assistant printed the emails. "My daughter died last year. We named our hospice wing after Emily," and left them in a box by his pool, where he read them one by one, each story a stone added to the cairn of his resolve. He visited the first Emily's Fund facility on a Tuesday, a converted strip mall in East LA where murals of shrimp boats and feathers covered former vape shops. Kids in wheelchairs swarmed him, not for selfies but to show their art. A boy named Javier had sculpted a Bubba Gump shrimp from chemoport caps. A girl, Lila, presented him with a comic where Forrest fought cancer cells with a ping-pong paddle. Hanks knelt on linoleum sticky with apple juice, his knees protesting, and let them decorate his Oxford shirt with glitter glue. A nurse snapped a photo, his smile unguarded, his collar sparkling like a night sky, that would later replace the Philadelphia Oscar on his Wikipedia page. That night, at a donor gala he'd vowed to skip, Hanks stood before a ballroom of sequins and skepticism. The organizers had prepared teleprompter platitudes, but he ignored them, pulling Emily's Polaroid from his wallet. The projector magnified her grin until it dwarfed the ice sculptures. her red sneakers pixelated into a blaze of defiance. She hated speeches, he said, the mic catching the rasp in his voice. So I'll just say this: childhood shouldn't be a race against time. It should be a box of chocolates. The laugh that followed was wet, collective, a shared catharsis. Even the waiters paused, trays of untouched caviar going warm in their hands. Critics called it sentimental. Pundits questioned sustainability. A YouTube essayist dissected the fund's logo. The feather symbolizes fragility, but the ECG line? Clearly performative martyrdom. Hanks stopped reading after the third article. Instead, he spent nights on the fund's hotline, listening to parents weep in the static between time zones. One call lasted until sunrise. A single father in Nashville, his voice sandpapered by nicotine, recounting how his son had laughed for the first time in months watching Toy Story. Woody's voice, the man said. It's like he knew. Hanks didn't correct him. By autumn, the fund had its first controversy. A Texas clinic refusing treatment to undocumented families. Hanks flew to Houston unannounced, walking into the boardroom with a janitor's keycard and a dossier of Emily's drawings. He left with signed policy changes and a security escort, the feather in his jacket pocket bent but unbroken. That evening, at a taco truck near the airport, a migrant mother approached him, her toddler asleep on her shoulder. Gracias, she whispered, pressing a Milagro charm into his palm. A tiny silver heart. He wore it on his watch chain, where it clinked against his Oscar medallion from the Academy. The night the fund hit $100 million, Hanks dreamed of Emily. They sat on Santa Monica Pier, sharing a choco, the ocean bleeding into sky. You fixed Jenny's story, she said, her sneakers kicking the air. Now fix yours. He woke to moonlight striping his bedroom wall, the feather floating in a water glass like a message in a bottle. At dawn, he drove to the hospice. Room 114 was occupied by a new patient, a teenager named Diego painting murals of space shuttles on the walls. Forrest Gump got to be an astronaut, Diego said, not turning from his canvas. Why not me? Hanks rolled up his sleeves, dipping a brush in cobalt blue. They worked in silence until the nurses came, their laughter etching itself into the wall's DNA. Returning home, he found a package, a VHS tape labeled Forrest Gump Outtakes, 1993. Inside, a blooper reel. Hanks flubbing the stupid is as stupid does line. Robin Wright corpsing at his accent, a younger self who'd yet to grasp how art imitates life. He played it on an old TV in his garage, the static crackle blending with his laughter. When the tape ended, he slipped Emily's Polaroid into the case, sealing it with a note. For the next kid who needs to see grown-ups screw up. The media cycle moved on, as it always did, a starlet's overdose, a political scandal, a new superhero flick. But in classrooms and clinics, in quiet moments between 4 drips and bedtime stories, Emily's fund grew roots. Hank's Oscar gathered dust, its gold plating flaking like dried mascara, while the feather above his desk stayed pristine, buoyed by the updraft of 1,000 kids still running. When the Academy called to offer an honorary award, his assistant expected refusal. But Hanks accepted, on one condition. The ceremony would be held at Children's Hospital LA, with winners announced by kids in treatment. The night aired unrated, its ratings dwarfed by the Grammys. But the clip of a leukemia patient handing Hanks a papier-mâché Oscar for Best Human scrawled in crayon would outlast every trending topic. Driving home, he took the long route, past the pier, the hospice, the mural-clad clinic. At a red light, his Uber driver recognized him. Hey, the man said, Afghan accent thick as the night. My daughter, she's in Emily's fund. They let her paint her 4-pole like a spaceship. Hanks leaned forward, the Milagro charm chiming. What's her name? Aisha. Means alive. The light turned green. Somewhere a monitor beeped. Somewhere a parent laughed. Somewhere, a feather drifted on a breeze only it could feel, and the city, for once, let it fly. 20 years later, the Santa Monica Pier had become a shrine to impermanence. Tourists still flocked to Forrest Gump's bench, its wood now reinforced with steel brackets, But the teenagers who once mimicked his chocolate's monologue were middle-aged, their own children scrolling TikTok where feathers once floated. Tom Hanks stood at the railing, wind carving silver streaks through his hair, watching a young girl in red sneakers chase seagulls. Her laughter rode the salt air, sharp and bright as the day he'd last heard Emily's. The feather in his breast pocket, no longer the original, but one of hundreds he'd collected, brushed against the Milagro charm, its silver heart worn smooth as a river stone. Emily's fund had long outgrown him. What began as hospice visits and shrimp boat murals now spanned continents. Pediatric wings in Nairobi decorated with Maasai beadwork Forrest Gump motifs. A Bollywood remake where Bubba dreamed of biryani instead of shrimp. A Syrian refugee camp where kids staged forest puppet shows with 4 tubing and surgical gloves. The Oscars had invited him back 7 times. He'd attended once, to introduce a choir of cancer survivors singing Blue Suede Shoes. Their raspy, off-key joy had drowned out the applause. The Piers Carousel music box jangled, pulling him back. The girl in red sneakers skidded to a halt, her mother snapping photos with a phone case that read, "Run like someone left the gate open." Hanks smiled, the expression etched deep as the lines around his eyes. He'd stopped dyeing his beard after Rita pointed out kids at fundraisers called him Santa Tom. Let them. Saints, he'd learned, were just people who showed up. A text buzzed, Luis' grandson, now his driver. "Ready when you are, Mr. H." The kid insisted on vintage cars, a nod to the '94 limo still rusting in a Burbank garage. Hanks walked past Bubba Gump's shrimp company, its neon flickering like a tired joke, and wondered when nostalgia had become a currency. His face stared back from t-shirts and mugshots of movie quotes, but the man on the merchandise felt distant, a character he'd retired along with the Oscar now repurposed as a doorstop in Emily's Fund HQ. The hospice was his last stop. Room 114's door, repainted countless times, bore layers of art like geological strata. Diego's space shuttles, Lila's chemocap mosaics, a recent edition of anime robots battling with ping-pong paddles. Inside, a boy named Mateo, 12 and fiercely bald, was teaching a nurse to beatbox. "Like this," he said, tapping his chest port in a rhythm that made the EKG dance. Hanks lingered in the doorway, unnoticed, until Mateo looked up. "Whoa, you're the Forrest guy." "Nah," Hank said, leaning against the doorframe. "Just a guy who knows a good beat when he hears one." They talked through shift change, Mateo's hands conducting an invisible orchestra as he described his magnum opus. A remix of the park bench monologue over trap beats. "Gonna call it Box of Beats." He grinned, for pole swaying like a hype man. His mother, dozing in the corner, stirred when Hanks placed the Santa Monica feather on Mateo's tray. "For your next album cover," he whispered. Driving back, LA's skyline glittered, a constellation of ambition. Hanks rolled down the window, letting the smog sting his eyes as they passed the Dolby Theater. A marquee advertised Forrest Gump, the musical, its neon bleeding into the dusk. He declined involvement, but the reviews made him proud. "A tearjerker that earns its stripes," said the Times. "Let them have the spectacle." His Forrest lived elsewhere. In Mateo's beats, in the Syrian puppets, in the Des Moines teacher's $14.27 Blu-ray now framed in the fund's lobby. Home was quieter now. His shelves held no Oscars, only feathers and shadow boxes, each labeled with a name and date. Emily's Polaroid hung central, its edges frayed, her red sneakers eternally mid-stride. The TV played a documentary about his legacy, archival clips of Philadelphia spliced with kids in fund hospitals. He muted it, preferring the rasp of vinyl as he lowered the needle on Aretha Franklin. The call came at midnight. Mateo's mother, voice fractured but calm. "He asked me to tell you, the album's done." Hanks drove back to the hospice in pajamas, Luis' grandson navigating with the grim focus of someone who'd grown up on stories about this man. This night, this sacred rhythm. Mateo's room smelled of lavender and loss. The boy's hand, cool and papery, clutched a USB drive shaped like a chocolate box. "Track 6 slaps," he rasped, the beatbox cadence still in his breath. Hanks plugged it into a nurse's laptop. Synth waves washed over the room. Forrest's voice chopped and screwed into something raw, beautiful, and entirely new. Mateo's heartbeat spiked on the chorus. Run, Forrest, run. Then steadied, a metronome finding its tempo. Dawn found Hanks on the pier again, the USB drive warm in his palm. Surfers braved the winter waves, their boards slicing water the gray of old movie reels. He knelt, letting the Pacific lick his fingers, and placed the drive in a tidal. Let the salt claim it. Let the next kid discover it, rusted and mysterious, a message in a bottle for the digital age. The feather landed at his feet. Pigeon, maybe, or gull. He pocketed it, adding to the collection. Behind him, the girl in red sneakers returned, her mother now filming a reel. Life is like a TikTok dance, she ad-libbed, tripping over her lines. Hanks chuckled, walking away as the sun bleached the sky. His phone buzzed. A text from Mateo's mom. A photo of the boy's mural, half-finished. A feather dissolving into sound waves. He called it the ripple. Hanks boarded the Ferris wheel, its gears groaning skyward. From the top, Ella sprawled like a circuit board, its lights pulsing with stories he'd never know. Somewhere, a nurse prepped a four to the rhythm of box of beats. Somewhere, a refugee girl sewed a forest puppet. Somewhere, a feather clung to a breeze, rising on thermals no one could see. He leaned back, eyes closed, the world humming below. Legacy, he'd learned, wasn't a monument, it was a current. You threw your stone, then let the waves decide. The ride descended, but Hanks stayed weightless, the feather in his pocket still flying.